Hello, my name is Lisa and I am a watercolor artist and I specialize in painting pets and wildlife. And for today's tutorial, I'm going to be walking you through how to paint a hummingbird using watercolors. I'm super excited to paint this hummingbird with you guys because hummingbirds are one of my favorite birds to paint. They're so colorful and they're pretty simple to start out with if you're just getting into painting wildlife. So first things first, we're going to sketch it out just using a light colored pencil. We'll start with a basic shape. So I'm going to do sort of a smaller on top, followed by a little bit larger. And I'll draw it a little bit darker just so you guys can see the shape I'm using. And if you have your own reference photo, that's great. I have one in front of me right now, just on my computer screen, but it's a fairly basic shape. So small oval on top, get a little larger. And that's the shape you want to see. And then we're going to do the beak, which will come out a little bit in from the head and come out quite long. And I tend to do a very loose sketch and then I'll erase as I go, as I decide what I like, what I don't like. So that's the basic shape there. And then just coming back from the beak a little bit, about I'd say ½ an inch back, maybe 3/4 of an inch back. We're going to draw a little circle for the eye. And just mark out where you want your little white spot to be in the eye so that we don't fill it in when we're coloring it in. And then we're going to loosely outline where some of the different color variations are going to go. So the green part will be up here. And then we're going to do the chest in some pink. And then we're going to have a little tree branch coming up. And you can just draw that very lightly. We're not going to add a lot of detail on the branch. And the little feet come around and wrap around that tree branch here. And you can't really see them underneath him, so it's not important to have a lot of detail here. And then we'll have just a small tail coming up behind. So that's the basic shape you want to have. It's not necessary to make it absolutely perfect for the outline. Because we're doing this hummingbird in a fairly loose style, it's okay to have it be a little bit more whimsical. So next up, I'm going to use my angled brush, and you can see the supplies that I use. If you look at the video description below, you'll see a list of supplies that I use. Be sure to check that out if you're new to watercolor. If not, you can either use a round brush, or if you have an angled dagger brush, that's great. And we're going to start by putting some water down through the whole bird. So we're just going to fill it all in, be quite liberal with it. Some of these parts we're going to end up keeping fairly light, but to start out, we're just going to get some water down. And if you miss spots, that's okay. It's a very loose watercolor, so don't worry. I'm going to leave the beak for now. And then if you have a light green, this is the next color we're going to use. We're just going to lightly dab the light green down on the head. Now it's going to go kind of crazy. It's going to bleed down, it's going to bleed everywhere, and the more color you use, the more it's going to bleed. The more water you have on the page, the more it's going to bleed. But just keep adding it. And if you find it goes too crazy, have a piece of paper towel nearby. You can dab up some of the places you don't want it to go. So we're wanting it to bleed into the body a little bit. We're not wanting to keep it strictly within the lines. That's how we're getting that really loose effect. So I did the green, the light green, and then I'm going to come in with a bit of the darker green. I have a Viridian green right here. And I'm just going to go in and do some dots, just some light dots to add some variation. And we're going to come in and add even more detail after, but that's just a start. And now I want to take a little bit of yellow. I have a very bright yellow. And I'm just going to add a little bit of yellow on the body while it's still wet. Now this hummingbird that I'm using a reference photo, its body is fairly light, but I noticed there's hints of yellow. So I'm going to add that in. And you can see here, there's a fairly strong line. That's just because some of the water on my page is already dried. So I can go back in, add clear water beside it, and it'll start to bleed. Now I've noticed it's already drying here, so I'm gonna add a bit more clear water on the chest. And that's where I'm gonna go in and add my pink. So now I can just start dabbing in pink. And I love the way watercolor sort of ebbs and flows on the paper as it's drying. That's what we really want to have here. It's not staying in the lines. We're not keeping it exact. And I'm gonna go over this green with a little bit of pink. It's gonna turn dark. And I'm gonna take a little bit of purple and just overlap that as well over here. I'm not actually gonna have black on this piece. I'm gonna use all color. So I'm gonna use purple here to draw the beak. And you'll notice I left some of the pencil lines. We can erase those after. So this is our first layer on the beak, so we're keeping it fairly light, and I'll come back in and add a bit more detail thereafter. We're gonna darken this with a bit more purple. And at any point, if you find that I move a little too fast, just pause the video, catch up. So as it dries, I'm gonna dab up a few areas just around the pink to try and add a bit of definition. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna pull some of the color out. So while this is still wet, I'm gonna take a clean brush, and I'm actually just gonna pull some of this out. So by taking clear water and butting up to it, that color will flow right out. And you don't wanna go too crazy. So if your page is quite wet, you can actually take a clean dry brush and just pull some of that back in so that your bleeds aren't too vivid. You want them to be sort of like just slightly coming on. I like the way these look, so I like to add them to my paintings sometimes. It's personal preference of it. You don't have to do too many. I'm gonna do one more on the head. So what I do, clear water, come right up, and then I butt up. There. All right, and then what I'm gonna do is I have a flat brush here, and I'm going to add a few droplets while I have those wet background spots. I'm actually gonna add a few droplets right now while it's still wet, and we're gonna be going in and adding quite a bit more detail, but this is just a nice time to go in while it's still wet. I'm always kind of layering and adding. And then last but not least, we'll add a little bit of pink. And I find adding the splatters at this stage of the game creates a lot of variation and texture as we layer it. So you'll notice I let some of the splatters go up and move around, and that's what you want. So while this is all drying, it's a good time to move down and do the tree branch because it's nice to sort of work your way around. So for the tree branch, I'm gonna actually use yellow ochre, and you can, don't worry too much about the feet because we're gonna go in with a dark blue to do the feet. So don't worry about leaving them white too much. I'm gonna keep this tree branch nice and light. So I'm gonna take the yellow ochre and not too much of it. And I'm just gonna come in and just drop little bits of it. Little bits down. Nothing too crazy. And then what I'm gonna do is take a bit of raw umber. It's a dark brown. Any dark brown you have should work perfectly. And we're just gonna add a little bit on the bottom of the branch. And we'll add a little bit more detail on this after, but the branch, we're keeping it like super simple. So we're actually not wanting to add too much detail because the focus is all gonna be on the bird. And so I'm gonna keep this part right here a little bit darker. This is where the shadow would be cast by the bird, so the branch would be a little bit darker. But other than that, the branch is gonna be quite light. And you'll see that right here, some of the branch actually bled into the bird, and I'm quite all right with that, but I'm gonna dab a little bit of it up with a clean, dry brush. Using a clean brush to dab up paint gives you a lot more control than using a paper towel, so sometimes it's a technique I like to use. So we're gonna let this dry fully, and then when I come back, we'll go in and add some more detail. All right, so that first layer is fully dry now, so we can go ahead and add the second layer. For this layer, I'm gonna come in and start adding a bit more detail. And so that means the eye, finishing off the beak, that sort of thing. So we're gonna do a mix of loose and detailed on this layer. So for the eye, I like to get the eye in as soon as possible. Sometimes it'll be the first thing I do. But I'm gonna use a Prussian blue. And if you do have black and you don't have a dark blue like this, that's totally okay. I prefer not to use too much black with watercolor just because I find it's a little more interesting to stick with the dark blues, the dark purples. And if you have a really fine brush, it helps here. If you do make mistakes, you can come in with white paint and add that white back in the eye. It happens, it's no big deal. And so there, now just all of a sudden it has a little bit of personality. So I'm gonna use a dark purple, and I'm actually gonna add a little bit of detail just near the eye here. And you'll notice it actually reads as fairly black just because it's going over the green, but I just find it has a little bit more interest. So I'm just using feather strokes to add some of this detail. And I'm gonna add a bit of detail on the beak now. So I'm going to do the line where the beak breaks in half and opens. Then I'm actually going to darken the bottom a little bit. And we'll be coming in and doing a little bit of highlights on this beak after with some white paint, but for now, just adding a little bit of lining on it helps. So that was the detail I was talking about, and now we're gonna go back to keeping it a little bit looser. So we're actually gonna go in and do the chest now. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of dab down some clear water. And for this, we're not quite as loose as the first layer. And I wanna start with using a little bit of purple right near the beak, and we're gonna just do some spotting. And you wanna kind of vibrate your brush on the page because we're not going in and doing each individual feather with this because we are keeping it fairly loose. You actually don't want that level of detail. And then we're gonna go in and do some pink. So I'm gonna do the same technique, just coming outward. And then there's gonna be little spots where I do sort of go in and add the actual detailed spots. But because there's a lot of water, in certain spots you'll be able to see it, and in certain spots you won't. And I like that. I like that variation. Take a little bit of red here. And you'll see the way here you can really see the brush strokes, and then as I come into the water, you lose that. So we're gonna add a few, using the tip of my dagger brush, I'm just gonna add a few feather strokes around the outside. And then I'm gonna take some yellow ochre and do the same thing, just creating a little bit of interest on the belly. Because this is a fairly beginner workshop, we're not gonna go too crazy. We don't need, like I said, having a lot of detail isn't important for this piece. This is all about learning the wet and wet technique and how to get sort of that loose style. So I added a bit more water here, clear water, and then I'm just gonna add in a bit more yellow. And as you get more fluent with watercolors, you can start to add more and more layers. I just like to do some yellow. I just find it a little more interesting than keeping the belly strictly white. You don't have to go too crazy. So I'm noticing the water's really pooling here and I'm not liking the way that's going. So once again, I have my paper towel handy and I can just dab that out. And then I'm going to take a little bit of purple and just add some more detailing here while it's still wet. Now our birds aren't going to dry at the same speed, so you might find yours is already drying and that's okay. You can always add more water later on. We're going to go add some clear water on the head and add just a tiny bit more on the head of the dark green, but not too much more. I'm liking the way it's looking. I do want to keep the head fairly light, but I like having just a bit more interest. So I'm using a clean brush in the areas where it got a little too saturated. I still want the watercolor to be fairly transparent, so I'm just going to lift up a little bit of that color using a clean dry brush. You'll hear me say that a lot, clean dry brush, because it's so much of how I control the paints. So it should look similar to this now. Of course, it'll have your own individual style. That's what we want. I'm going to take a little bit of medium brown and just add that. It's like a reddish brown. I'm going to add that around and contour the bird a little bit. Just have a little bit on the body. Because my body's still wet, it's going to bleed in some areas. I'm a little bit sporadic the way I work with these types of pieces. I'm constantly adding and adding and adding till I get it the way I want it. Which is about now. I'm quite happy with the way this is looking. I'm just gonna add the tail at the back now. So I'm gonna do dark blue for the tail. The underside of the hummingbird's tail is quite dark, so this Prussian blue will work perfectly. And we'll probably have to do more than one layer, but we'll see how it goes. I'm using the Prussian blue in place of black on this piece. So where you would normally use black, I use Prussian blue a lot more. And like I said, if all you have is black, that's totally okay. I believe when it's starting out, it's really important to use what you have and not invest too much at the onset. I found that when I started out with watercolors, all I had was a student grade set, basic watercolor set. But because it was such an economical set, I was never afraid to take risks. I find sometimes when you start investing in the higher end watercolor supplies, you're more scared to take risks. And with watercolor, that's so important. It's so important to try new things. So we're gonna take some dark brown and I'm gonna add a bit of detailing on this branch. Nothing too crazy. Like I said, the branch is really not the focal point of it, but we just wanna add some lines on it so it looks more like a branch versus a one-dimensional object. And I tried to do the foot and the tail at the same time, but I'm not liking the way that went, so I'm actually gonna lift up a bit of that. And that happens to me all the time, where I'll think I can get away with doing things all at once, and I can't. And so I just lift up the color. Mistakes are totally normal with watercolor, and sometimes you can fix them, and sometimes it's a little trickier. So now I'm noticing as it's drying, I just wanna add a little bit more detail to this part of the hummingbird under the chin. And that's the way I work with watercolors. I'm always kind of jumping around. And then I'm going to take that same reddish brown and come back in here again and in here again. And then lift up a bit of pink. That's a lot of variation. I love that. All right, so now I think we're gonna add a little bit more splatters. So I'm gonna do that, and I'm gonna be a little bit more liberal this time. So for instance, around the tail, I'm gonna add some clear water, and that'll cause it to bleed out. And then we're gonna add some more yellow. I like to use a mix of clear water droplets as well as the color, because the clear water ones pick up the color and create quite a variation in size, and I love that. I'm gonna do some green. Basically, I walk around the painting. I go around the painting and I do similar colored splatters to what I have on the painting. All right, so I'm pretty happy with that. All I'm going to do to finish it up is add a little bit of detailing, which we'll do when it's fully dry. So I'm gonna let this dry now. All right, so now that that second coat is fully dry, we can go in and add the final finishing touches. So I find the way the tail dried, it's a little bit one-dimensional, so I want to add a little bit more detail to that. So I'm going to take actually the purple, and I'm going to overlap and have an additional line where a tail would be, and we're going to do one here. So we're just having different layers of the tail. And then I'm going to add a little bit to differentiate where that foot would be. I'm going to darken that. And then I'm actually going to go in with a little bit of purple up here and darken some of this a little bit more. I like to have some real strong points in my painting where the color really pops. But I'm not going to go too crazy. And then I'm going to do that with the pink. We're not using any water for this first. Like, you're having water on your brush to grab your watercolor, but you're not putting water down on the paper first. This is just about going in and adding a little bit of detail. That's all I would do for that. And then I'm going to take a bit of purple and add just a few lines around the edge, just to tie that purple in all the way around. Use it as kind of a black, not to outline, but just to add a little bit of detail. And then I'm going to take a white paint. I have something called poster color, but a white gouache would work. Any white paint that you have around. And I like to do highlights this way. With watercolor, if you can leave your whites white, that's always ideal. But I think it's fun to go in and add some little highlights with some white poster paint as well. So I'm going to do some on the beak. I'm going to have a few here. Then I'm going to have a second little highlight on the eye. And this tends to dry a little bit more transparent, so sometimes having a second highlight on the eye, that one won't be quite as dark once it's dry. And then while this is still wet, I'm going to go in and add some little highlights here, and they'll bleed in wherever it's still wet, they'll kind of bleed in a little bit, and that's okay. A little bit here. Around the eye a little bit. The thicker you make it with this paint, the more opaque it's going to be, so something to keep in mind. And then towards the bottom, it's quite wet still, so I'm not going to do too much here. I'm going to add a little bit on the feet. If yours is dry, you can add some here. Mine is somewhat dry, but all right, so that's pretty much about what I'd want it to have as far as detail. So go ahead and sign it. And be sure to hit subscribe if you want to watch other videos just like this one. And if you could give the video a thumbs up, I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching with me. Please leave a comment below if you have other ideas of what you want me to paint. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.